peatlands and forestry before we started the session. So if you go to the code at the top of the screen, you can enter the Mentimeter. So we'll just give a few minutes for this. So for those that just arrived, we're just doing a little activity where we're just getting impressions about peatlands and forestry before we begin the session. So if you go onto the code at the top of the screen, then you can join this activity.
Sorry guys, I've just stopped sharing my screen for a second because it came up telling me that voting is closed. So I'm checking that I can make that open for everyone. So if you just give a second and then hopefully it's going to work.
Maybe in the meantime, while we're figuring that out, I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to what this session is all about and a bit about the larger project. We're from RE-PEAT, so we're a youth-led organisation changing the paradigm on peatlands, or that's what we like to think. And we have recently kind of been focusing on the UK, especially to do with peatlands in UK, not only because it's a very peat-rich country, but also for a number of other reasons. For example, the COP26 is going to be in Glasgow, and there's going to be the World Congress on Soil Science coming up. And we thought this was a really good opportunity to make an impact in UK politics. And we thought that doing a session on forestry and peat seemed to be coming up a lot, where this tension was arising between, when do you plant a tree and when do you leave space for a bog? And there seemed to be lots of confusion around this, and maybe different perspectives. And so we really wanted to just dive into this a bit more and see what came out. I don't know whether we've got any results for the Mentimeter yet, have we?
Yeah, let's go share my screen again. And sorry, you're also seeing all of my hectic behavior on my laptop. Okay, so if we go on to the next one, and if you use the code at the top and also the Mentimeter, then you should be able to start entering words for what words come to mind when you think of peatlands. And I'll give a few minutes for you to do this one and then move on to the next one, which is forests. And then if you just enter them all in, and then at the end we can share the word clouds that people have created, or that we've all created together.
Cool. I'm just going to leave you to do that, like as we go along, then, and carry on a little bit with introducing some of the speakers that we have today. So we have, oh, my internet is unstable. Am I still with me? Yeah. Yeah, so we have Thomas Sloan, who's a Forest Science and Policy Fellow at the United Bank of Carbon, the University of Leeds. His background is in assessing the impact of land management on carbon storage, particularly in peatlands, and his PhD at the University of York focused on assessing the change in carbon storage when deep peat is afforested. We also have 3 speakers from a project called Sphagnum Splat. So that's Kate Foster, who's an environmental artist and runs a project called Peat Cultures, and became embedded in Peatland Connections, Crichton Carbon Centre project, which is also supported by Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership. And her long-term project highlights diverse cultural values of peatlands in Scotland and the Netherlands. Also from Sphagnum Splat, we have Ted Lemming and Morag Patterson, who are award-winning professional landscape photographic artists based both in Italy and Scotland. Going further than simple aesthetics, their work explores the landscape and our human interactions there in the context of climate change and biodiversity loss. And the final speaker is Dr. Renee Hermans, who works at the Peatland Code coordinator for the IUCN UK Peatland programme. And she leads the operation and development of the Peatland Code, which is an innovative funding mechanism for peatland restoration. So I think I'm going to, at that point, hand over the mic to Thomas. So yeah, welcome.
I think I might be a bit early, actually. Did you have one more thing on the agenda before me?
Oh, did I?
Yeah, I think Frankie's forgotten what she spent the past week working on.
Oh, true.
So I'm going to share this video first. And I just wanted to say as well, I put the link now into the Mentimeter. So if you just go there, you should be able to keep adding words throughout the session, and then we'll create these nice word clouds where you can see. And maybe your impressions also change throughout the session as well. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the video as well.
Let's talk a bit about forests and peatlands. What connects these two ecosystems and what makes them different? Forests are hubs of biodiversity, containing around 80% of amphibians, 75% of birds, and 68% of mammal species around the world. They also host over 60,000 tree species and are home to many other terrestrial plants. So, in terms of genetic biodiversity, forests are invaluable systems for life on Earth. Peatlands, on the other hand, while not as staggering as forests in terms of how many individual species they can hold, offer a large number of rare species with highly specialised functions. This means that peatlands are vital in terms of something called ecosystem diversity. This type of diversity relates to an ecosystem's function within a certain geographical area. In the case of peatlands, because they only form in very particular waterlogged conditions, the plants that live on them are especially adapted to the low levels of oxygen and acidity found there, which means that the local ecology on and around a peatland can become very unique, thus helping to create diversity for the region as a whole. Carbon storage is another benefit of both peatlands and forests, which means that they both help to reduce the effects of climate change. However, the two ecosystems store carbon in very different ways. The main difference is that peatlands store carbon through an accumulation of semi-decomposed natural matter, which then gets captured in thin layers over millennia. While forests, on the other hand, store most of their carbon in the form of trees, which have a much shorter carbon cycle, as they re-release the carbon back into the atmosphere after they die. So, how does this work then? Well, while a tree is growing, it absorbs carbon dioxide, or CO2, via photosynthesis. It then releases the oxygen and holds the carbon, which forms the wood, litter and soil. The soil normally holds the carbon for a long time, but the wood and litter can release the carbon at different rates as a result of decomposition. The difference with peatlands is that, being waterlogged and lacking oxygen, the normal cycle of decay is disrupted, allowing them to store carbon for far longer periods of time. So unlike forests that release carbon as part of their natural cycle, a healthy peatland will simply store the carbon for thousands of years, provided it isn't drained, burned, or otherwise degraded. Today, peatlands store 42% of the world's soil carbon, and despite only taking up 3% of the planet's land surface area, peatlands store twice the carbon as all the forests combined. In some places, peatlands have been drained to plant trees. This is not only an environment that the trees themselves probably wouldn't choose, but also, when the peatland is drained of water, the organic matter which was once stored underground starts to finally decompose and re-release. Just imagine all those layers of plants breaking down all at once. Another connection between peatlands and forests is that they both provide fantastic hydrological functions. Trees are great at soaking up water, and wood debris can create small dams, both of which can prevent downstream flood hazards by slowing water flow. Upstream peatlands are also able to prevent floods by buffering the flow of water to downstream spaces. And some trees can even soak up pollution from their environment, which can be beneficial for water purification, while healthy peatlands are also able to drastically increase water quality by filtering out dissolved organic matter. In fact, about 70% of the UK's drinking water comes from peatlands. Degraded peatlands, however, have the opposite effect and can contribute to worsening water quality, which means heavy chemical treatment of drinking water. So, in summary, both forests and peatlands provide a huge number of ecosystem services and are vital for human and non-human well-being alike. It's important that we make space for both peatlands and forests and understand their different roles in the climate and ecological crisis.
So indeed, I did forget my own video. Of course, that's the way it goes. So without further ado, on to Thomas, who's gonna connect to some of the things that came up in the video, which is the difference between trees and peat when it comes to carbon. So.
Yeah, that was great. That was a really good explanation. I'll just try sharing my screen again. If anybody can see anything addition they shouldn't see, let me know. Can everybody see the PowerPoint then?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about the history and challenges of planting on bogs in the UK. So my name is Thomas Sloan, and this is a lot of the work I'm going to discuss with you was done as part of my PhD at the University of York in collaboration with the University of Highlands and Islands and the Forestry Commission. As was mentioned, I'm currently a forestry science and policy fellow at the United Bank of Carbon at the University of Leeds. And I mention that just to say that we're going to talk a lot over the next 20 minutes about the damage that was done by forestry in peatlands. And I wouldn't like you to come away from this presentation thinking that all forestry is bad. So we're obviously, in order to combat climate change, we're going to need some systemic changes to our economy, and whatever solution we produce, forests will probably form some part of that. So I would hate for you to come away with the impression that forests are bad. Forests are in fact great, but you've got to make sure that you put them in the right place. And we're going to talk this evening about some forestry that was put in arguably the wrong place. So forests on bogs. For a very long time, bogs were regarded as barren and very desolate places that didn't support industry. Now we know now that peatlands and bogs support a huge range of ecosystem services, including biodiversity, as we've seen, water resources, carbon sequestration, as we just saw. But traditionally, there's not been a great deal of economic activity there. There's been, crofting, grazing, peat cutting, but over the centuries, they were often regarded as these very, very inactive, barren places that wouldn't support people. Oh, I should point out on the slide, this is the William King quote is using Tories in the original Irish sense of the word, rather than the modern sense. And a lot of the aspiration to plant forests on bogs was to actually provide industry and jobs in regions that didn't actually have any. And these attempts started as early as the 18th century across Europe and in the UK to produce forest plantations and hunting lodges, and they were largely unsuccessful. And in fact, certainly within this country, widespread afforestation only became technologically possible really in the second half of the 20th century. And we'll talk about some of the changes in technology and practice which made plantation possible. But even when it became technologically possible to plant a lot of these forests, it wasn't always commercially viable. And within the UK, there was a second factor, which was tax incentives, which were also quite important drivers of these forests being planted. And we'll talk about those as well. But why wasn't it possible initially to plant forests on peat? Well, as we've seen, peatlands have, and especially bogs, have very high water tables. And planting, in order to establish a forestry plantation, you really need the trees to be able to root properly. And if there is a water table at or near the surface, your trees are never going to be able to root and are never going to be able to develop. And in the second half of the 20th century, some technological changes. So I haven't credited this photo, but I think it's from the Forestry Memories website. And this is a low ground pressure tractor using a double moldboard plow to plow furrows into a bog. And you can see on either side of the plow, you're getting peat thrown up, forming these ridges. So when you drain the peat and you have these ridges, what you're doing is creating a large mass of peat above the water table, the ridge where you can actually plant, a tree, and allow it to, if you keep the peatland drained, allow the roots to develop properly. You'll also use fertilizers because peatlands tend to be quite nutrient poor, and you'll use suitable trees. So Sitka spruce was used quite extensively as it's the main kind of one of the main crop species in the UK. But also lodgepole pine was used either as a mix or a monoculture. And lodgepole is a little bit more tolerant of waterlogged conditions. So the idea is if you included this in the first rotation, you'd be able to dry the peat even more. And so the second rotation would produce a much better crop. Now, what happened is you actually ended up producing quite poor quality plantations. So this is a photograph after about 50 years of growth at a plantation in Caithness. You see the trees haven't developed particularly well. The drainage hasn't been maintained. A lot of the trees have fallen over because they've not rooted properly and they've just been blown down. And this was kind of the story with a lot of the plantations, especially around Scotland. because even with this technology, they weren't really commercially viable. And the reason that they got planted was actually quite a lot to do with the tax incentives that were offered to plant them. So on the surface, it's quite a good idea generally. If you want to promote something, one of the policy tools available to you is to change the tax structure to encourage whatever activity you want to encourage. And throughout the second half of the 20th century, tax breaks were used to try and encourage forestry development. Where there was a problem was that the tax breaks were worded in such a way that a lot of inappropriate plantation ended up occurring. So the tax that you save, the deductions that you can make, weren't ever based on the quality of the wood you output or whether you produced a commercial crop. They were just based on the total area that was planted. And pretty soon people realized that you could buy quite a lot of cheap land in areas that had bogs and plant forests that you never really expected to produce a commercial crop. And the result of this was you have a lot of very bad quality in a commercial sense plantations that are purely exist to try and minimize tax for wealthy individuals. And there were a lot of stories around the time that celebrities such as Terry Wogan and the snooker player Alex Higgins and Cliff Richard were involved in these sort of forestry developments. I realize some of you might be too young to know who Cliff Richard is, but he's the one on the right in this photograph. Ultimately, then private planting overtook planting by the Forestry Commission by the mid-80s. So you can see there's this explosion of private plantations that was in many cases due to, or as a result of trying to minimize tax rather than produce a wood crop. Where this was particularly acute was in the flow country. So the flow country is one of Britain's last wildernesses. It's an internationally important bog. It's one of the largest bogs in Northern Europe. It's a 40,000 hectare complex of wetlands and peat. And over the second half of the 20th century, about almost 17% of it was planted, which compares to 9% of deep peats nationally in the UK. So this is really the front line of this sort of forestry. And this was quite controversial at the time. So there was an increasing public awareness initially on the basis of the biodiversity damage that was done there. So there were a lot of important species in the flow country, a lot of ground nesting birds. And when you start putting in woodlands, you begin to encourage sort of mammals, ambush predators, and the bird numbers suffer. Opposition to this planting came to a head with the 1988 publication of the report Birds, Bogs and Forestry by the Nature Conservancy Council, which was really a systematic survey of the damage that was being done to the flow country. At the same time, there was a lot of activism going on. David Bellamy produced a documentary about what was happening, and there's a bit of media awareness of this battle of the bogs that was happening in the north of Scotland. And in the ensuing controversy, about 200,000 hectares, so about half of the flow country, was designated as legally protected. And ultimately, the 1988 budget changed the tax incentives to remove the forestry incentive, and that combined with changes to guidance by the Forestry Commission meant that by the mid-90s, this planting on bogs had really dropped off. The controversy also ended in the disbanding of the Nature Conservancy Council. A lot of the work that it did is now fulfilled by the devolved government. So the question is, why should we be concerned from a carbon standpoint about trees being planted on deep peats? So I think this is just replicating what we saw in the animation earlier, but broadly speaking, I think you'll all be aware that beneath the water table in peat, the catatelm, the anaerobic portion of the peat, there's very little oxidative decay. The oxygen doesn't penetrate, things don't decay. So you have these, undecomposed and semi-decomposed organic material, and you store a large amount of carbon over time. When you begin to plant trees in these areas, as we've discussed, you lower the water table. So instantly you're exposing a lot more of the peat to oxygen, to aerobic decomposition. So you're increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that's lost above the water table. At the same time, through drainage, you're probably washing out a lot of aqueous carbon. So that's dissolved organic carbon and particulate organic carbon, which will probably find a pathway to the atmosphere downstream. So the key question in forestry, and certainly in this country, is whether the amount of carbon taken up by tree biomass is going to offset the amount of carbon lost from the peat. And I say in this country because there is quite a lot of evidence from Finascandia. So within the Scandinavian countries, within Finland, forestry in peat areas is quite well established, but these will often tend to be in fen peatlands, shallower peat, and often on peatlands that are already have shrubs or forestry on. So there's actually much less intensive and invasive work required to bring these areas into commercial plantation. Also, the wood that you tend to produce in other areas of Europe will be of higher quality for these reasons. Now we're going to circle back to talk about wood quality in a little while. But generally speaking, and again, I think this was explained really well in the animation, when you produce a commercial wood crop, if you produce very good quality timber, you're going to be locking up that carbon, say if you use it in construction, for possibly a couple of 100 years. Whereas if you're producing bad quality timber that's, say, going to be mulched or used for wood fuel, it's going to return to the atmosphere very quickly. Now, again, it's probably not as good as having that carbon stored in peat for millennia, but generally speaking, in the Finascandian context, the good quality wood that's produced means that the carbon's locked up for longer. There's been a variety of studies across the region. Generally, papers have found a net boost to carbon sequestration, but there is quite a range of results. That's probably not the case in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of my PhD research that was recently completed, just to give you a little kind of case study about how the situation might be different, especially in the flow country of northern Scotland. So this is an image of Badakiel Forest. So this is about 50 miles south of Thurso, the north coast. And here there was a forestry commission plantation that was about 50 years old, and we went in to do a little bit of research here and in a few other places. Now, initially we looked at old ground level surveys from before the plantation and compared the ground level to the modern day ground level 50 years later, so between 1966 and 2016. So you can see the black lines, these are transect surveys. The black lines are the 1966 ground levels. The little green bars are where the forests are planted, and the red line is the new ground level 50 years after planting. So you can see there's been a lot of subsidence underneath these plantations, where the water table's dropped and the peat's compressed and possibly been lost to the atmosphere. And overall, there was something like a half-meter loss of peat depth underneath these plantations. So almost 13% of the peat was lost. Now this is some early data. This hasn't been published here. I'm still working this up, but just to illustrate generally, we also looked at peat cores, the amount of carbon actually stored in the peat, and the amount of carbon stored in the forest, and found that although it was quite variable, on the left here you've got transects on that first site, and on the right you have some other sites around the flow country. Generally, it's very variable, but genuinely what you see is that even when the wood, the carbon accumulated in wood is considered, you've got often quite a large net loss of carbon from the system. And it's only really scratched the surface. In terms of the fate of the wood, which we discussed earlier in the Finascandian context, here, certainly at Badakiel Forest, all when the plantation was felled, all the wood went for mulch and went for fuel pellets. So it's been cycled back into the atmosphere quite quickly. There's other factors as well to consider. So the hydrological footprint of the plantation. So when you drain a plantation, the impact of that drainage will be felt further from the actual silhouette of the plantation. So 50 to 100 meters out, you might still be seeing some of the effects of that drainage. And this is only the second rotation as well. So the site at Panacea was largely restored, but if it had had a second forestry rotation put in, we probably would have seen a much more accelerated loss of carbon because the peat's already dry and primed to lose carbon. So in general, peatlands are now recognized as being much more important in terms of ecosystem services and the tremendous amounts of carbon that they store. And the restoration and protection of peatlands is now promoted by many international bodies and recognized by international conventions. In Scotland, where the bulk of this forestry took place, the government aims to restore 40% of the estimated 600,000 hectares of damaged peatlands. So that's all types of damage, not just forestry, by 2030. Where there's a slight conflict that governments at the moment are trying both to encourage forestry and to restore peat. And again, fortunately in Scotland, the policy of controlled woodland removal allows not replanting on peatland sites that are a priority for restoration on ecological grounds. And one of those ecological grounds can be carbon sequestration. So I think Brené is going to talk in much more detail about some of the restoration that's going on, but hopefully it's moving in the right direction now. So thank you to everyone who contributed to this research, and I'm happy to take questions whenever it is we're taking questions.
Thank you, Thomas. Super interesting. And so like wrapped up into the history, which is also something which peatlands always get tangled up into. So next up, we're going to have Sphagnum Splat, which is a really fun, interesting project and fun. And we're going to have Kate Foster, Ted Leeming, and Morag Patterson talking. So over to you all.
It definitely was fun, and I know there's people here who can say some more about where it was and why it was and how it happened. But I'm going to give you an impression with Morag and Ted. But first, let me remember to say that Galloway is in the southwest of Scotland. And it's a wet area, so there's plenty of peat. So everyone can imagine a landscape painting. But what does artwork engaging with landscape use look like? How can artists engage with the interface between forestry and peatlands? And how can we make it social and support sustainable forestry practice at the same time? We're artists based in southern Scotland, and we're presenting two new strategies emerging from Galloway: sphagnum splat and bog splotting. As background, many areas of Galloway were planted up in the 1970s. Planting on deep peat is widely recognised as a mistake. Some raised bogs, like the one in this photo, are being restored. And sphagnum splat was about helping this process along. It's not too late to sequestrate, but unbelievably, peaty uplands are still being put to plantation forestry. Bog splotting was invented to salute new regulations which could put an end to this. We'll now describe these events. Starting with splat. We can take pride that it's been called a beautiful disruption. But what is it? A family day out to celebrate peat and to help the peat's recovery. And the first ever was in October 2019. With the permission of the landowners, a group walked to South Dune Moss in the Galloway Forest with placards, banners, boxes, baskets and music instruments, and a dog with a coat. We were planning to throw balls seeded with sphagnum into an area where a spruce plantation had been felled as forest-to-bog restoration process. The moss balls can grow and help the continuing cycle of peat formation. And I was there as part of my peat cultures project with the Crichton Carbon Centre, supported by Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership. I hope these photos will give you a flavour of what it's like to be on a sphagnum splat. These are lines by the poet Jos Smith. And this is a report from another sphagnum splatter. And Morag, you said you'd kindly read it out.
Sure, yeah. This is from Helen Kerran, who's a resident in the Glenkens area of Galloway. Myself and my 8 and 10-year-old gathered at clattering shores, not knowing quite what to expect, but attracted by anything with splat in the name. We were just dressed for mud, but others had come prepared with brightly dressed clothes, banners, and even musical instruments. It had quite the festival feel. Our motley crew set off towards the peatlands with plenty of experts on hand to explain the significance of what we were doing. The children soon became experts at spotting where the sphagnum moss was growing, and even better at forming it into mud balls and splatting them. It was a fantastic afternoon out in the wilds of Galloway, and a real insight into the importance of the issue. And in terms of a sensory experience, all, the sound of the music, the feel of the moss, the sight of the views, and the smell of fresh air. The children may have also tasted the mud. Thank you to all who arranged it. It was an amazing experience.
Yeah, this event preceded a new 3-year project that was mentioned in the, or talked about in the first edition of the UK Anthology, Peatland Connections. And just to repeat, it works with communities, artists and ecologists to bring peatland management into practical forestry planning. It's a kind of think out loud exercise with various organisations and individuals who are shifting their thinking and working to revise their land management plans. But recently, this month, in April 2021, a group of bog splotters turned out in wetsuits again, with the landowner's permission. And they were here to support new plans by Forestry Scotland to limit the peat depth for new tree planting. This move would really help show what can and should be done in shifting the paradigms of peatlands and forestry at a local level. The new blog post on RE-PEAT's website gives more background. I'll put a link in the chat later. But what is splotting? Ideally, this group said they wanted bog rolling, but you can only do this on healthy bogs. On degraded bogs like this, the group had to stage a bog splot. That, they assured me, means getting properly wet with carbon-laden water and a mission to draw attention to the need for change. Bog snorkeling was possible for some, but as you can see, they had protective clothing and survival equipment. Ted Leeming was there and has kindly agreed to read a letter from bog splotters.
Dear friends, is it okay that government money subsidises peatland ploughing for forestry? We say no, ploughing and peatland damages the climate. Peat stores more carbon than plantations. So we offer boggy congratulations to Scottish Forestry and the Forestry Commission for trying to change the rules to stop peat from being ploughed up and turned into forestry plantations. These public bodies are about to suggest new guidelines for forest planting that avoids intensive forest cultivation on all peat deeper than 10 centimetres. This was previously 50 centimetres was the minimum. This is a good move and would be great news for peat bog lovers and great for climate, biodiversity, rivers and floods. But Scottish Forestry and Forestry Commission need our support as the forest industry is not keen on this change. We went to a nearby plantation to check out a peaty ditch We swam in water full of carbon. Bogs are not supposed to have ditches in them. Bog snorkeling would not be possible if this ditch was healthy, if this bog was healthy. Here, all the sphagnum moss has died and the spruce trees are stunted or have blown over. We need to save sites like this from being damaged by plantations. It is time to stop ploughing up and draining peat bogs in order to plant citrus spruce. So we're celebrating the potentially great news from the forest authorities. We salute them for trying to change the rules and protect the peat. But more still needs to be done. Public funds are still being used to encourage forest plantations while at the same time destroying peat. This is madness. Damaged peat loses more carbon than the trees soak up. The peat and carbon flows into the drains and the drains and up into the atmosphere. It's bonkers. Bog snorkeling is sane by comparison. Yours sincerely, some bog loggers and bog sprogs. P.S. No trees or tadpoles were harmed in the making of this photo shoot. The forest owners and forest contractors were in on this action and agreed. Planting spruce trees on peat is a waste of energy.
Thank you, Ted. And thank you to the people who put together these images, which are by Ted and Morag, and wrote the letter at such short notice, actually, especially for this event. Bog spotting drew attention to how regulations are part of a much needed paradigm shift in forestry practice. More nature-based forestry would make both landscapes and communities more resilient to future changes. It has to be wrong to subsidise forestry to cause climate and environmental damage. Instead, foresters should be regenerating the type of trees that can live on and with peat-forming mosses, such as birch and pine. I think we've got some minutes to have a conversation, because talking to Morag in preparation for this, I realised there are some great points to make about art, community and ecology in her experience. So can we take 5 minutes to have a conversation? Is that good? Great, I saw some hands. Morag, can you say something more about the measuring stick?
Yeah, sure. The measuring stick, it was actually a friend's idea, and it was to give people a really strong visual sense that would perhaps stick in their minds of the scale of the difference of going from 50 centimetres being the permitted ploughing depth for peat and bringing that down to 10 centimetres. Because often when we see those things just written or we read about it, it can kind of go in one ear and out the other, so to speak, or just not make absolute sense to us. And we thought if people could actually see this stick in a ditch in the bog, then that would really stay in their minds, and they'd know why people were rolling around in a bog celebrating.
It seems like you've got quite a technical interest in bogs now, but did anything in particular prompt your appreciation of bogs?
Well, like a lot of people who live in Galloway for a long time, you know, I think we all have these kind of ideas of the legend of the Silver Flow, the quaking bog that resides between the Rins of Kells and the Dungeon Crags. And we're all used to hearing stories of people losing their machinery in there, and it's got this kind of real mythical sense. But it was actually an event with yourself, and I think Emily Taylor was there as well, run partly by the Galloway Glens in 2019, where we went up and did a workshop at Nowtop, which is near the village of Corsic in Dumfries and Galloway. And we looked at some of your work, and we looked at some of the projects Emily's been running, and then we went out for a beautiful walk on the bog up there and sat down and just enjoyed some time talking. And then later that night, I was so inspired that my oldest son and I, who is an adult as well, went walking barefoot across a bog that was near to our house, and actually just enjoyed the feel of that underfoot. and just gazing around at the bog cotton and appreciating it, and kind of realizing the number of species that were there. And ironically now, that same bog that we were walking barefoot on has a forest application on it. And so it's interesting. I'm a community councillor as well as an artist, so we get to comment on these proposals. And I think we're all waiting to see how much this new regulation, if it comes in, may or may not have an effect on that particular plantation as well as others.
By the way, this is Silver Flow in the background behind me. I just thought we should go there in some sense in this meeting.
Oh, isn't it beautiful? Yeah, it looks really deep, the way the deep flowers cover.
Yeah, thinking. No, I'm here. I wondered if you might say something about forestry in the area near you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we live in a small village called St John's Town of Dalry that's got a few hundred people live there. It's quite typical of the area of Galloway we're in, that you have villages where the parishes have quite a wide geographic area, but a small number of inhabitants. And we've currently got 3 forest proposals that we know of in our kind of parish. The one above us has got 5. And we've already have a large amount of forest cover in the area. So, our landscape is increasingly being prospected, partly due to the tax incentives and the government targets for planting trees. And quite a lot of that is going on peaty ground, unfortunately, at the moment still. And it's quite difficult for communities to have the resources to comment properly on these proposals, because there's no basic guidance even for how a community can interact with a woodland creation application. Although we are consulted, there's no kind of guidance or support to kind of help you through that process. And it's a difficult area to navigate, I would say, for lay people to understand who the key players are, and how the system functions. And unfortunately, it is kind of stacked fairly heavily in favour of commercial forestry at the moment.
I would agree with that, as someone who's living in an area just where hundreds of hectares have just been put to forestry. And I really admire the way you've engaged with it. And bog splitting is a really unusual way to show appreciation of new regulations. What was the idea behind it?
Well, again, it was talking to the same friend who had the measuring stick idea, and we've been talking about forestry a lot over the last year or so. And when we heard that the Scottish Forestry were possibly going to change the rules, we decided that we really had to celebrate that somehow. And we kind of wanted to change the narrative a bit away from a lot of the interactions around this sort of development come as angry letters and furious newspaper postings and on the Facebook forums, obviously, as well. And we wanted to do something celebratory, theatrical, fun, and also something that other people could visually engage with again, to something that would catch people's eye and make people wonder what was going on, and then hopefully be driven to look a bit deeper at the background.
I think it's an amazing photo of the snorkeler. I spent some time looking at it. There's so much in it, with the machine that I've learned is a forwarder right behind it at work in the forestry, and the posture. Amazing photos, and congratulations to you both for getting that. It's fantastic. But you were saying also that you work with the community council, and I think maybe there's something about the words that we use about bogs that are important to that, and maybe you could say something on that one. And I think that's my last question.
Yeah. Well, in the process of kind of trying to review and comment on these proposals, if we're lucky enough to be given the habitat surveys, which I have to say doesn't happen as a matter of course, you come across a lot of language in there that made me realise a lot of the way we refer to our landscapes as negative and has the opposite meaning to the actual biodiversity value, you know. And so, I mean, bogs and mire in the English language are certainly both used in a negative sense in terms of being bogged down or mired in difficulty. And then going through the habitat surveys, I also realized a lot of the other words, unimproved, poor, rank, have all these connotations that sound as if we're just planting on something that's kind of disposable or throwaway, whereas improved and semi-improved are the lands that you currently can't plant on. And I just thought it was really interesting and wondered if we needed to work a little on reimagining the language of landscape as we kind of try and reframe the way we go forward in the ever constant land use debate that we're in.
Wow. Something to work with for sure. Yeah. Mm. Well, I'm really sad that splat and splot were necessary. I have to say they're really enjoyable and really good to connect through it. So thank you. And we hope you enjoyed Splot and Splat too.
Thanks, Kate.
It might take me a moment to extricate myself, so patience. Great.
Thank you, everyone. That was super interesting. I love those images. So, like, such a unique way of responding to a policy framework. So I love that. And yeah, I just posted in the chat, there's actually an author, Robert McFarlane, who talks a bit about yeah, the way that we use language and landscapes, specifically peatlands. So maybe that's interesting for people to read up a little bit more as well. I also wanted to mention that if anyone has questions, just to put them into the chat, and we'll do the questions all at the end. So then they'll be recorded because maybe you'll forget. So indeed, on to the next speaker. So that's Dr. Renee Kirkfield-Hermans. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen. Great, well, thank you. So yeah, I'm Renee Kirkfield-Hermans. At the moment, I'm working for the IUCN UK Peatland programme. I'm the Peatland Codes Coordinator, but I'll be also talking a bit about my earlier PhD work. So we've now heard a lot about how we don't want the trees on the peat and what they do to the peat. So I've got a bit of a, I guess, a bit more of a positive story about what happens when we do restore these peatlands back to peat from these forestations. So just a bit of background. Obviously the UK has a lot of peatlands, so about 10% of the UK is covered in peat. Unfortunately, 80% of it is in a modified state, and about 20% of the peatlands are drained and afforested. So it's quite a big issue, obviously, like we've already heard tonight. So public finance can't fix the scale that we actually need to restore the degraded peatlands back. So we also need some private investment for that. And I'll touch on that slightly later on, because that's where my current role comes into play. But first, Tom already touched on this, but just to go over it just briefly, why did these peatlands become afforested? Well, this is an article from Forestry in 1945. And you can see how people at that point viewed peatlands, and I'm just going to highlight a few bits in here. So you can see it was a wasteland. People saw it as a wide desert with no life, where no life is found, as a derelict stretch of highland peat bog, derelict peat clad land. So you get the picture. It was really bad, and people wanted to be able to use it. That was the views at that point. So just a picture of really early on how they were trying to plow the peat at that point. Obviously, that wasn't very successful to actually drain it. But Tom showed those pictures of how those big machines eventually managed to drain some of the peat. So what happens when you do that? Well, these are just a few pictures from also up in the flow country in the north of Scotland, where you can see, I like these snowy pictures because then it becomes very, very easy to spot where the trees are. So you've got these really big, dense parts of trees, just, well, some lodgepole pine actually, some lodgepole and some Sitka spruce, sorry. Very dense, quite difficult to work in, to get through. So yeah, not ideal, basically. So just some general information about forestry on deep peat. So that's what I'm mainly focusing on tonight. So like Tom already said, the woodlands and trees are actually great. Native woodlands and peatlands are two of our largest natural climate regulating ecosystems. So both are really important. And it's in order to meet the urgency and scale of climate change and biodiversity obligations, we need sustainable management and enhance of both peatlands and woodlands in the UK, but without compromising one for the other. So it's really important that we do have both, but in the right place. So the positive effects of the removal of commercial plantations, along with hydrological restoration on peatland function, are widely understood and acknowledged. So we know that it's great to actually remove these forests. Forest planting and restocking on peat translocates your carbon from a large soil carbon reservoir that's secure for millennia on the natural conditions, so in the peat soils, to a more reactive store, like Tom touched on. So you would basically, which regardless of its end use, is more likely to be converted back to the carbon dioxide within years to decades. However, healthy natural peatland ecosystems continue sequestering carbon indefinitely. So moreover, when other benefits of peatland restoration, so like biodiversity and water quality, are also considered, there's a very clear case why we do want to restore these forested peatlands. So the optimum for carbon and biodiversity are, so you maintain your non-forested peatlands, you restore your forested peatland to open habitat, and you also secure new tree cover on non-peat soils or areas that are of benefit for peatlands. There are some scientific uncertainty still around the relative climate impacts of plantation on and restocking and removal and peatland restoration, but the general scientists do agree that it's good to remove these forestry on deep peat. So, like I touched upon, there's a lot of restoration needed in the UK of these peatlands. There's a lot of innovation going on, but also the costs are really high. So we do need some additional money, private money coming in on top of a lot of public money that is going in at the moment. So one way to look at it is using the Peatland Code. So that's my job at the moment. So I work for the Peatland Code, and the Peatland Code is a voluntary certification standard to attract private funding for peatland restoration projects in exchange for climate benefits by providing assurance to buyers of carbon credits. So it's a way to get private money into peatland restoration. And we are looking, unfortunately at the moment, forest-to-bog is actually not included in the Peatland Code, but it is something that we are working on. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we can include that as well under the Peatland Code. So I just thought I'll just show you some pictures of what actually this restoration on the ground looks like when you are just starting to do it. So it's big machinery, but with all these low pressure machines that initially cut the trees, and then depending on how good the quality is, they're taking off. So this was literally just cut, and I was trying to locate my actual measurements. Some of my instruments that were still somewhere down there, and then eventually they were taken off to sell on for biomass, basically, because they were not, like Tom also said, they're not good enough to actually do something else with. Another big part of it is blocking your drains then afterwards, and this is obviously not this was not afforested, but is something to show how some of these reprofiling is happening. So when you've got really steep drains, then when you drive a machine like this over it, it brings it all more in, and it pushes some if there is any vegetation left, that pushes that into the bare peat basically. So it helps it to recover more quickly. So I'm just now going to talk a bit about my specific PhD research. It was a couple of years back now, when I was working up in the flow country and measured greenhouse gas fluxes from actually a corner sequence of restoration sites. So this is just to show where the flow country actually is and where my research sites were. So quite up high in Scotland. So the flow country was afforested with non-native conifers up until the 1980s. And in the late 1990s, the RSPB, they bought a lot of areas up there, and they started to manage them through large-scale restoration, so forest-to-bog restoration. Initially, that was done for habitat restoration, purely habitat for birds and other species. And then later on, obviously, the carbon story came into play. So they funded that part of my PhD because they were really interested to find out what actually happens to your greenhouse gas fluxes when you do these kind of restoration. So because they started in 1998 with these restoration. At that point, it was fell to waste. It was very basic restoration. So they fell to trees and they dropped them basically in the ditches and they left them there. And then you can here see, so this site, when I took this picture, was about 15 years after they did the initial felling of the trees. Then you've got a site here that was 2006. So that was about 7 years, I think, when I took this picture. So again, fell to waste. So the trees were still quite small when they fell this, so there was no point of them taking them off. And on this side, you can see actually that's where they took trees off. And here as well, even though you can still see quite a bit of branches left there, but that was taken off this side later on as well. And same here. So it was great for me that I could measure from quite a big scale of different ages of restoration, even though not all the same techniques were used. And actually, after I finished my PhD and during then, a lot of these techniques became really improved. So now they are doing ground smoothing as well to try and get that topography that you get from drainage and ploughing, to level that out to help with raising the water table basically. But all those kind of additional measurements were not done when I was doing my measurements. So my main research question is restoration successful from a climate perspective? That was what we were mainly after. So I was measuring carbon dioxide, methane, and also nitrous oxides in my chambers. And this is just a picture of me up in the bog. And there you can see those measurement chambers. So you put your chamber on the bog for, if I remember correctly, 30 or 40 minutes. And then you take a gas sample out of it every couple of minutes. So you then can measure the concentration of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide in your gas sample over time. And then that's how you know how much comes out of the soil. So I am this is, even though I said I measured from a whole corner sequence, I'm just going to show you some results here from the near natural bog and the site that was the oldest that was restored. So at that point, it was about 15 years old, 15 years after the initial felling of the trees. The data that you can, I'm sorry. Yep. So the data that you can see here is net CO2, and that is measured by hydrocovariance targets. So it's also the uptake of CO2 that's included in that, and not just the respiration. And then it's my own methane and nitrous oxide data from my chambers in here. So you can see here, so the near natural bog has quite a high uptake of CO2. So that's all taken out of the atmosphere, and that's a net uptake of CO2. It's got also a small uptake of nitrous oxide, and then it also has a small emission of methane. So these numbers all have already included the global warming potentials. So it is taken account that methane actually warms your atmosphere more than CO2. So even then you can see that actually a near natural bog is, as we expect and as we kind of know, is a net climate cooler. So that's great. And then if you look at that site that was restored 15 years previously, and actually not to the standards that we are doing at the moment, after 15 years, you can see it's also storing quite a lot of carbon. So the CO2 is taken up quite a lot of CO2, not as much as your near natural bog, but it's doing quite well. It's got a small flux of uptake of nitrous oxide as well, and your methane flux is similar to the one of your near natural bog. And in total, the net flux of it is also, it has a climate cooling effect. So that's great. It's not as big of a climate cooling effect as a near natural bog, but considering the techniques used at that point, it's a great result. So the conclusions from that is that restoration, but forested bog restoration can be really successful from a climate perspective. And with these really bare minimum of techniques used, it takes quite a long time to do recover fully back. But it's great that it does come back. It's expected that with additional management, you will speed up that recovery. So that additional of more furrow blocking, for example, and flattening of your micro topography. So just to acknowledge that all the people that worked with me during my PhD, and the University of Stirling and the RSVB for funding the PhD. And these are just my details, that if you have any questions, you can drop me a message if you would like. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Renee. So nice to see all the images from where you were doing your restoration. So interesting, especially with all the machines that you have to build, especially for the peat, like a whole world. So thank you. So I think we'll now move on to questions. So I think some people have already posted a few questions in the chat. But I'm just going to go through them. Sorry, my laptop is now going weird. Yeah, so the first question was from Neil to Thomas, and it was, can you provide links for references that support those thoughts on the second rotation? Perhaps you could post some links in the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I answered Neil directly already, but yeah, generally well, I'm certainly going to dig up some links for Neil, but I think generally speaking, there is an assumption that the longer that a peatland is drained for, you know, the more sort of deep carbon you bring up, the better the oxygen penetration is, the more carbon you're going to loss. It will accelerate over time. But then equally, you know, the second forestry rotation will also probably be better because the peat's drying. So it's how that balance changes. But yeah, I'll certainly fish things out for me.
So what is the rotation again? Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, sorry. The forestry rotation. So typically, a single rotation. So it's just when you cut the trees down and start again. So each sort of cycle with the trees.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. So then the next one was from N. Cranston, which was, is there policy around transparency in the supply chain for the corporate customers of wood grown on peat grounds and bogs? Maybe you want to ask this question because it was a long question. Would you like to turn on your microphone? And if not, maybe just say in the chat and I can also read it again.
I'm probably not the person to answer this either. I think, but presumably, I think that by the sound of it, there's a few people in the chat who are who seem to know the sort of wood supply chain quite well.
Okay, I'm going to ask the question again, and then if whoever wants to answer it, if someone has an answer, then just popcorn style, I guess. So, is there policy around transparency in the supply chain for the corporate customers of wood grown on peat grounds and bogs? And where does that fit into the sustainability commitment, carbon and other environmental impact calculations? Does anyone have an answer on this? And if not, we'll move on to the next one. No. Okay. Kieran asked, can forestry biomass in the UK and Ireland be sustainable and how? Does anyone have an answer on this one?
I think they're quite tricky questions because you would get a different answer depending on who you asked. Hence the kind of polarity in the chat over, you know, a few of the forestry issues. I mean, I certainly don't have a definitive answer, and you might get a different definitive answer from different people.
I guess, do you have an opinion on it? And maybe we can phrase it like that? Or you don't have to give an opinion either.
Is Gordon's popping up there? His.
So there were two questions there to which I have a partial answer, and there's more egg says it depends. With a lot of this stuff, I think an old and wiser forester than me said, where you sit depends on where you stand. So, you know, a lot of this depends on where you're coming from. And therefore the questions, the answers aren't always straightforward. In terms of certification, there's been a certain amount of chat about that as well. So that's really, these are the way in which the forestry sector demonstrates its sustainability is by complying with international standards, essentially. So there are a couple of certification bodies that lay down standards for sustainable forestry. And to get a grant out of the Scottish government, British government, English government, Welsh government, you have to comply with something called the UK Forestry Standard. And industry sector would very much maintain that if you're complying with the UK Forestry Standard, then what you're doing is sustainable. There's an additional standard which is called UKWAS, UK Woodland Assurance Standard, which is a voluntary system, but it's basically the same thing, but sets slightly higher standards. The UK, both of those standards are up for review at the moment. UK Forestry Standard is almost certainly will be reviewed over the next while. And there's quite a lot from the community perspective. You have to remember that these standards are international, so they apply in. We have one person here from Uganda this evening, for example. They apply in Uganda as much as they apply in the UK. So within the standards, there are some quite considerable measures around how communities are addressed in forestry operations. And there are some measures there which I think are very interesting. If they were applied to in the same way in Scotland as they are applied in Uganda, we would have a different approach to forestry. There are a lot of measures that if you want to go and if there are indigenous people living in a forest or people living within a landscape in Uganda, the forestry company has to consult quite widely with local communities before they do anything, and in a meaningful way. The way in which that's translated into Scottish, into UK practice means that the consultation is nowhere near as thorough, essentially. The UK Forestry Standard relies upon three things. One is things that you must do, so that's the law, and you're required to do things or not to do things. So, for example, you have to follow health and safety law when you're a forestry operator. There are other things that you should consider do. The should. So you should do this if you have if you want to be a good forester. But there's no real force behind that should. If you look at something and decide you don't want to do it, then you don't have to. And peat, second rotation forestry on peatland is an example of that. If you take an ordinary bit of degraded bog and there are already trees planted upon it, you should consider restoring that forest to bogland. But if you choose not to, then that's your choice. As long as you've considered it, and that can be as simple as going, well, that's an idea, but no, I don't want to do it. Then you'll have complied with the standard. And then below that, there are things which are nice if you feel like doing them. And, you know, nobody does them at all, unless they have a real focus on something other than making money. And, you know, realistically, we're in a world in which there's a big focus on making money. Forestry companies have shareholders to answer to. The people who are buying forests in Scotland and creating forests are also really interested in, you know, mostly there's a big financial driver for afforestation. And very little. It's interesting that Thomas referred to tax as a social issue, and in a way, it is a social issue. But you know, mostly it is a social impact on people. And you know, anyway, there's a lot more I could say about that. Do you want me to say something about biomass? Have you heard enough from me?
I think there were some questions on biomass. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Biomass. Biomass on small scale is probably a good idea. Biomass in the way we're practicing it in this country is almost certainly a bad idea. So the largest coal-fired power station in Britain now largely burns wood. It's not burning wood from Britain. It's burning wood that is it's wood that is certified as sustainably produced from mostly North America. So we're shipping, as a country, we're shipping vast amounts of biomass across, and a lot of it is coming from fairly boggy, you know, but the other thing that's happened this evening is we've kind of run forestry and bog together. So in a lot of countries in the world, they have woodlands on bog, and that's quite a natural system. Those are wetland forests and they're a fine natural ecosystem. What we have in this country on the whole is plantation forestry on bogs, which are a different thing. But there are semi-natural habitats which have been stripped of forest in a sustainable way in North America so that we can burn biomass instead of coal. This enables the UK government to say we're doing one of the things that allows the UK government to say that we are doing wonderfully in terms of reducing carbon dioxide, because by not burning coal and burning wood instead, we can claim to be reducing the carbon dioxide that we as a country emit. We pay a vast amount of money in subsidies to allow this wood to be burnt. So a big receiver, I can't remember, it's £15 million a day or something or other. £15 million a day in subsidy goes to the largest of these wood burning power stations. You know, there's a substantial quantity, and it does mean that over the last 10 years, or in the last half decade mostly, the amount of wood imported into Britain has gone up enormously. It's gone up by almost the total amount of timber that is produced in Scotland every year. So, you know, we can't do this. And Neil McInnes was talking about the business of reuse. As a society, we have no concept of reuse. We are not, of reducing, never mind reuse, reducing consumption is a real priority, and there's no emphasis coming on that from government. What we have is instead a belief in a tech fix, and forests are part of that tech fix. Anyway.
Absolutely crazy statistics there. The UK government is just from so many angles. Terrible. But that's why we're doing this. So I think like that brings back the realities of yeah, what we're faced with and what the culture is like now. So I think all the more reason for us to delve into this subject and highlight it and tell them that we're not happy with this. So the next question that I have was from Jonathan, which you kind of talked a little bit about when you talked about the different policies that exist, but maybe somebody has another answer to this question. But it was, how can peatlands be restored if the land is being used by the governments for dumping or it's been taken over by local farmers? I wonder if anyone else had any thoughts on this. It was also directed in the context of East Uganda. So it's maybe a different, different context, but perhaps there's something that could be applied. No? Well, I think if you have any thoughts, maybe you can also write them in the chat. And the next one was from Marag. So we are planting the most resilient forests for the expected surge in demand question. So I think that was slight question statement. And yeah, so Nicole was the next one. Would a newly stored site have a net warming effect to begin with before starting to sequester more carbon? So I think maybe Renee, you could answer that one.
I must say I don't necessarily know at this point. There are people who have measured with flux towers after just restoration, just felling the trees and what's happening on site. But because I was only measuring with dark chambers, I was not measuring the CO2 uptake basically. So from just my measurements, I can't say yes or no to that question. It's expected that yes, when you do a lot of, especially a lot of the groundwork, so when you do the ground smoothing and that kind of stuff, that then initially you will get some more CO2 coming out of it. But it's also, I think usually as soon as you raise your water table high enough, you do instantly, very quickly reduce your CO2 emissions from a peatland. So hopefully it's very quickly then it starts restoring. So it's not going to be sequestering within months, but at least it will reduce your emissions massively quickly.
It's good to know. I was just thinking, I don't want to put you on the spot, Jonathan, but I thought maybe we have a little bit of time. Maybe you could also just talk a little bit about your context and some of the things that you do as a youth group working in Uganda. If you don't want to go, then that's totally fine. But if you do, the floor is yours. No? Okay. Oh.
Hello? Yes, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity this evening. I'm called Jonathan Olwenyi from Uganda, East Africa. I work at Uganda. It works on environment and social development. And in Uganda, things are very much different from what you people talk about in the UK. Because what I used to see when I was a little boy, when I was growing up, it is now no more. It is just a history of it for myself. Because wetlands have been destroyed, peatlands have been destroyed, forests have been chopped down for cultivation and all that. But I'm really so I'm happy this evening that I've attended this session organized, and I thank the organizer because what I've learned today, I'm really going to put into implementation to follow up with the government such that the trees more trees are planted in the country, wetland restoration, then a peatland restoration. Thank you. Maybe if someone has anything to say or to ask me about what else I do.
I'm trying to think of a question now. I know a little bit about what you do, so it's cheating a little bit, but maybe you could also talk about the way that your group also responds to multiple different issues in the local area. Maybe interesting.
Oh, wow, thank you. We do, we create awareness among communities. We do sensitization about the importance of the wetland and biodiversity conservation here locally. Our group, we were first formed as a community-based organization. Then later we gained status as a non-governmental organization. But what we see on the ground here in Uganda, it is, I think, because of the growing population and employment, then above all, many people are just not informed because Africa holds the largest population of illiterates, I think, in the world. And many of our parents and other generations, most of them have not attained school. So we come in and we train them on the importance to protect natural resources, to restore the ecosystem, the lost glory, you know. For them, we make sure we get deep into the ground and we meet them physically, and we talk to them the importance of natural resources and and restoring what was lost. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to also mention while you're here that we're doing Peat Fest. So every year, well, this will be the second time, RE-PEAT is going to host a festival, 24-hour festival, all to do with peatlands. And Jonathan is also going to be on a panel. So maybe that was a little bit coming in and explaining something. But if you wanted to hear more about what he's up to, then he'll be talking on the 29th of May at Peat Fest. And now I'm going back to the questions. And I think there was a few more questions. So maybe we have time for one more, seeing as we have a minute. And just before we go, the Mentimeter is up. So if you want to add any more words or have a look at the word cloud that we created, then you can go to the Mentimeter now. So the last question I'm going to ask was, do government grants seek to maximize area planted or maximize for carbon sequestration? does anyone have an answer to this?
Hi, I can answer that. Neil McInnes here. Purely and simply, area is the target. That's the government's published target every year.
Thank you.
I don't know. There's not a great deal more that you can add to that. And, you know, a lot of the native woodland, as I've said in the chat there, particularly has been established on really nutrient poor ground, as we know, and much of the plantation forest, which has been established over the last 30 years, which has been scant relatively, following the debacles in the Flow Country in the 1988 tax review, has also been planted on very marginal ground. And as a society, we get what we put into these things, and you know, there's quite a significant disagreement between the agricultural lobby and the forestry lobby in this country. I think it's fair to say. And if we want to take pressure off peatlands, which I think we do, there aren't many foresters who would turn their nose up at some nice brown earths rather than you know, nutrient poor sites. Then as a society we have to steer that. We have to steer that by demand. We have to steer that by consultation. And I also saw a comment in the chat there about how do you respond to land management plans. I think that's key, that all of these proposals are publicly consulted. So you know, everybody has a voice in terms of making comment on that.
Yeah, and I guess something that was brought up earlier is how do we get that voice? Sometimes it's hard to find out where our voice is best used or what the systems are. So maybe also like transparency is also kind of.
Yeah, I think it's very transparent, really, if you have an interest in it. So, speaking for the activity that I undertake on the national forest, we undertake public consultations. There are public notices. There are details on websites. There are, you know, we go through quite a number of channels for individuals who don't feel comfortable approaching either the Forestry and Land Scotland or private forestry companies. Then I would urge you to go to your community council, because community councils are also consultees in most forestry new afforestation schemes, and also restocking. And I think Emma Stewart made the point earlier that restocking is where the eye can come off the ball with peatlands. There's a lot of heat and light, quite rightly so, on some of the mistakes that have been made in the past and are still being made in terms of new forestry. But actually, there are a huge amount of peatland which is being restocked.
No. Okay.
I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, I think it is. Did anyone have any last questions? And if not, I think we might end the session here. And thank you everyone who also chipped in and added their thoughts and experiences. That was nice to get a bit more conversation going. Any final comments? And if not, thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you next month, because we're going to be doing one every single month until December. So hope to see you then. And thank you.
Thanks for organising.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Kate go, shall we go?